And then before that, I actually was born in Kansas City.
Okay.
Here, and lived in Grandview.
Okay.
Welcome.
So you
Thank you.
switched from Grandview to the other side,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
But I do like
Missouri to
Missouri.
Kansas.
Missouri is my home state.
So I checked the audio, and if you guys just want to hold the mic whenever you guys have to
Oh,
talk,
so
that
we
would be,
okay because it's not good right
yeah,
here.
it's not like picking it up as
Okay.
much. So
Okay. We can do that.
sorry.
All right.
Thank you.
So we ready to start? All right. Hello. What is your name? It's to say for the record.
Oh, okay. My name is Dr. McKinney King. Would you like our
Just spell it. Yes.
Makini, and then last name King, King.
Hi, my name is Lana Davenport, LONADAVENPORT.
I'd like to thank you guys once again for coming out here to speak with us about discrimination and segregation. And to start us off, how do you and umkc as a whole view diversity in Kansas City?
Okay, that's a big question.
Start off big.
No. How do we view at UMKC? How do we view diversity in Kansas City?
Yeah.
I think according to our mission as an urban serving institution, we value diversity, which is a numbers thing, which means we feel like the more diverse the group of people who come to UMKC, and then also the city, the more diversity of ideas and input, and the better the solution. The other part of that we value is inclusion. So it's not just about whether or not you have representation from different groups of people, but it's also whether or not those people feel included, and whether the environment is safe and set up in such a way where everyone, no matter who you are, feels like they can be the most productive, successful people. So I will stop there and let you comment on that.
I guess I 100% agree with you. It kind of sounds like an oversaid statement, but it's the fact of the matter that diversity is a strength in every way, and so it's essential to be able to value it in every way and at every level in order for everyone to be able to thrive. It is the lifeblood, right? And so I guess that's, I just ditto what she says.
Yeah. So just to be clear, it's basically no matter how diverse you are, we are all united and we can all come together.
We should. We should. So that's an aspirational goal, I would say. I don't know of any place that's perfect, and certainly not Kansas City. But it's something that we, as it's part of our value statement, it's something we're constantly working towards. So in every part of in UMKC and whatever department you're in, or whether you're staff, faculty, students, it's something that should be considered in whatever you're doing. How are we implementing diversity, and how are we making our spaces, our classrooms, our community collaborations, how are we making them inclusive, with the ultimate goal of becoming unified and working together for solutions to problems.
All right, is there anything you'd like to say?
She's on point.
All right, next question. Why do you believe that Kansas City is so segregated, yet UMKC continues to be the most diverse school in Kansas?
Is it the most diverse school? Well, Missouri.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it the most diverse school in? Is that like a thing? I don't know.
I did a little. I did a little bit of research because I did mention I'm looking at the school, and the diversity here definitely attracted me because I'm a mixed kid. My mom's white and my dad's we're Muslim, and so we definitely like to look at the diversity statistics. And we were looking at like schools in Kansas and also Missouri as well. And definitely since you guys include like the Johnson County area within your in-state tuition, we looked at like other schools and the diversity as well. And you guys were definitely one of the most diverse schools.
Oh, okay. So you're saying one of the most diverse schools in the area. I mean,
Yeah.
like, okay,
Yeah.
okay, because I was thinking it. I don't know the demographics of like schools in St. Louis or
Yeah.
Right.
okay in this area. Okay, so can you repeat that again then?
Why do you
Sorry.
believe that Kansas City is so segregated, yet UMKC continues to be the most diverse school in Missouri?
Oh, okay. Do you want to go first on this one? I don't want to go first every single time.
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
It's a battle.
It's hard to, like, I can't speak about it from a comparative sense because I don't know the mindset and the intent behind a lot of the other institutions in this area, right? Like, it would be weird and very likely highly inaccurate to say that we really value diversity in comparison to another
Right.
institution, right? I do think that there's probably a lot of intentionality that goes into the work that UMKC does. So not only UMKC, if you haven't looked at their diversity statement, is actually, for me, one of the broader statements I've ever seen on diversity, which is something I really appreciate. It's an artifact of culture, right? I also think that there's probably a lot of intentionality in terms of position within the city from a physical location. Specifically because we know in Kansas City that there's been a great deal of segregation historically and currently, and everyone who we've talked to very commonly brings up the city or brings up the street Troost as a dividing line in the city. UMKC, part of UMKC's campus is right on Troost, and that was intentional in its placement, right? And that's also an artifact of thought process and intentionality because we want to be a place where everyone can be accessible. And we can also challenge a lot of those preconceptions because it's harmful to people, right? We know that. I'm going to yield for that.
Oh, yeah.
You keep going.
Thank you very
I
much.
think also UMKC is not a city. It's a private institute, or not a private, a small public institution, smaller public institution. So they have some control and sort of creating a system that can implement some of the policies that would create a diverse and inclusive space. I think it's hard. I think it's simply harder to do that in a city. So if we acknowledge that Kansas City, not unlike many other cities all over the country, is a very hyper-segregated city, and we say that's not what we want to be, then then we can do that we can try to implement policies that would prevent that, make that less likely to happen on a smaller scale. So one of the ways that we do that is to have a strategic plan around diversity. So here's the way that UMKC is going to make sure that type of segregation does not happen, that we really try to focus on making sure that the people who come to UMKC are representative of the community. And then once they get here, what are the ways that we can keep them here and make them successful? I can't really speak for an entire city, but I think that when as many people in administration and faculty are working toward those goals for diversity and inclusion, that messaging gets received by everyone who comes in onto this campus, and so then if I know that I'm a student coming to UMKC and I know that they value diversity, they value diversity of ideas, diversity of ethnicity, gender, all these things that are stated in our strategic plan, I'm going to move in my life with those values and make decisions that represent those values. I don't know how a city would do that. That's a hard thing to do in a city. It's huge. There's millions of people involved in that. There's a few thousand involved at UMKC. And also, again, I'll just say we're not perfect at it, but we know it's something that we're working toward. So.
Thank you so much for that. And I actually didn't know that UMKC was part on Troost Avenue. I actually didn't know that.
Yeah?
So a good historical fact right there. All right. How did discrimination start, and what are the social impacts in Kansas City?
How did discrimination start?
Yeah.
Like,
That's its own dissertation.
I know. Oh my goodness. I have to think about that. I mean, that's a philosophical question as much as like.
Right. Because it's been
mean,
around since humans have been
I
around.
know, exactly.
Really?
Yeah,
I
in a
mean,
lot of ways.
discrimination. So, I mean, if we think about like, and I'll put this here so we can both kind of talk. Discrimination is making decisions or choices where certain people get access or privilege and other people are denied that based upon whatever race, gender, ethnicity. So I don't know where it started. I think there's some ideas around it being like a part of human evolution, and the selfish gene, and you want to make sure that in group, out group, you want to make sure that the in group, the group that you're part of, is successful even and thrives, and their genetic line thrives. Are you checking the audio? Okay.
No, it's fine. I was just checking.
Okay. Even at the expense of anyone from the out group, so people who don't belong to your group. So I think that's like an evolutionary thing. That's a theory. I don't know. I don't know if that's something that's debated or not. But
I think like probably going back to unconscious bias stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of that is, as you already talked about, very like evolutionary. Our brains take in a lot of information ultra fast, faster than we can ever imagine, and we act on it without thinking. Part of that was to continue the human race and not get taken out by, poisonous snakes way back in the day or something to that effect, right? But we created a story around some of those things because of, I'm going to argue, fear. Fear of unknown, fear of difference, whatever that looks like, and fear of scarcity, right? And so this idea of there's not enoughness is where this domination and supremacy piece comes from in a lot of ways, because of thinking that I have to be a certain way to exist or my line to continue or whatever that is in the long scale. But that's where like a lot of the thought process comes from at its root in regards to how that's manifested across time. Things around racism and a lot of significant competition on worldview and class. I mean, man, when we talk about socioeconomic class, it's very, very explicit there, although it's very explicit in a great deal many of them. Same in sexism/genderism. That's what I'm going with today. So, I mean, it's not a new thing. And there's levels of it, right? There's the individual discrimination aspect of it from an interpersonal relationship standpoint, but it also, of course, because that exists, blooms into things like systemic policy discrimination, which are things like housing and rights to positions or healthcare or all those things which many would argue are a basic human right, whereas some are like, nah, that's earned, and then we have a conversation about that, right? And of course, when all that continues is when all those things are left running rampant and not checked, and we're not fighting for those basic human rights, is when you have like major world catastrophes, when you see things like genocide on epic levels, right? So mass annihilation and mass exploitation. So I'd say like genocide and slavery and things like that.
Is there?
Oh, well, I was going to ask if you could repeat the second part of that question. What was that?
What are the social impacts in Kansas City?
Social impacts. Oh, okay. Well, the social impacts of discrimination in Kansas City are not like any other place. It means that certain groups are being denied things or have far worse impacts around things like education and health outcomes and income and wealth. And wealth is like a really big one around here. If we're talking about the dividing line of truth, we know that if you look at the outcomes of people east of truth versus west of truth, people east of truth do far worse in terms of, have low income, lower wealth, lower health outcomes, poor access to education, less education. I mean, so, higher rates of police contact, and then also incarceration. So you can name any outcome whatsoever, and there is an obvious discrepancy east of truth versus west of truth. So those are the impacts of discrimination.
It touches every system.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Linking back to what you guys said in the beginning, what are the motivations of individuals to stereotype and discriminate against other races?
So I think Lana talked about this a second ago. I think it's fear. I mean, I think we would both say it's fear. It's fear of not having something or something being taken away. I think a lot of it is. I think the emotional experience of that fear is rational. I think the evidence for that fear is irrational. So what I'm saying is, if I have to give up something in order for this other person to have access to something, I might feel like I'm losing something, but I'm really not. I'm actually gaining something. I'm gaining a lot of things. Because this person who I'm giving access to, so for example, like education, if I'm saying, I'm trying to think of an example, like if I have to give some certain amount of money in order for a person who might not actually ordinarily get access to a quality education. So fear might say, oh, wait a minute, if I give this person money to get this education, it might mean that I might not get the same education, or my children might not get the same education. But I feel like that's very erroneous and dysfunctional thinking, because in truth, if I help somebody else get a quality education, it does not mean that I'm not going to be also educated, or that my children are not also going to be educated. It actually means that that person is going to be able to produce and again thrive, and maybe help me problem solve some, who knows what granting access to everyone will help us with. So
I would totally agree. I think as you already said, I think really what it comes down to is like the fear, and then like it's the struggle for folks to think beyond the individual self.
Right.
It takes a great deal of effort, and depending on who you are and your positionality in society, your ability and access to things like empathy and your practice using empathy and understanding of someone else's experience can vary very widely. And so I think that is definitely part of it as well. Because it's so easy to tell you about my personal experience. It's the story that I've lived. But to understand deeply in a meaningful way another person's experience can be very difficult. And we don't always see that. And for some, it's more important to have that skill than it is for others based on their positionality with privilege. If I have all the privilege, I don't have to think a lot about anyone else. Whereas if I don't have privilege, I have to think about that in a broader way.
And then I guess to the point about, because you did ask about like stereotype, you asked about stereotyping and why I guess people do it. Again, it's how our brains work. It's how we categorize a ton of information. You know, we have to put people and things, experiences into groups in order to make decisions. But the counter to that is so the reason that we do that, especially around race and ethnicity, is because we're so segregated. Like, we don't know people who are not like us, not on a human level. I mean, we know that they exist, but we don't. You know, these are not our neighbors. They're not in our family. You know, we may go to work with them, or we may like go to classes with them, but I think that by and large, people are not inviting people unlike them who don't share their same race or ethnicity. They're not going over to each other's homes and having dinner, and you know, their kids are not playing together. So we're so segregated. So if you do not know somebody, you will make a decision about that person based upon the information that's available, which is in the media, on the news, in movies, you know, what somebody said, and all of those things are not necessarily based in evidence. So if I don't have that actual human contact, and I'm not integrated with people who are not like me, it's easier for me to fall prey to stereotypes that put people in boxes that, you know, they don't necessarily belong. And then because I don't have that human contact, it makes it easier for me when policies and laws or things are happening to these groups of people who are not like me. It's easier for me to separate myself from that because I don't really know anybody. You know, I might say on a cursory level, oh, that's really sad that that's happening to them. But because I don't really know, I don't really have genuine relationships with, for example, non-Black people. You know, if I don't have genuine relationships with people in the Latinx community, Muslim people, who else? Asian people, LGBT people. Then when things happen to those groups, I'm going to care less because I don't know them, right? So that is a product of us being so segregated and so very much feeling okay with living these lives where we don't see the value of making relationships with people not like us.
Yeah, and so much of that is also really in relationship with this idea of being uncomfortable. And so very often we make decisions based on what feels less difficult, what feels less uncomfortable. And often when we're presented with two options and both of them feel uncomfortable, you see someone stay in place without making a decision at all because turning towards pain is difficult, and that seems to be the only options they have, right? And so breaking out of our segregation bubbles in so many different ways is literally choosing to engage with our discomfort and wonder and start asking those questions about, like, what is it that I don't know? And what is it that I am is it likely that I might make a mistake and hurt someone? Yeah, because, you know, we have a high level of ignorance when we're not bursting out of our own bubbles. And so we have to figure out a way of acknowledging that things like perfectionism and fear of mistakes are actually a tenement of things like white supremacy that keep us silent and keep us from being even willing to try, right? It's this guilt and shame piece that keeps you spinning instead of actually making action to make something better.
So what I'm understanding is that everybody likes to stay in their comfort zone and don't really like to go ahead and meet other people because just the way, like, for example, Asian people like to stay with Asian people because that's a common relation with them. Is this what's happening with everyone?
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's part of it. So I think when different groups do it, it's for different reasons. So when you look at non-white groups, if we're sticking with race, because that's kind of the predominant thing in this country in particular, if we're looking at racial groups, most racial groups are going to be in the in the minority. So there are not going to be as many of them. So there's a safety mechanism attached to that comfort. When everyone else around you is white, there is some safety and protection in being with people who are like you. And it's more noticeable. So if there are 100 white people and only 5 Asian people, when those 5 Asian people sit together, it's noticeable, right? But what we don't talk about is the 95 white people who are sitting together, or like together. So somehow the burden gets put on explaining why non-white people are together, and less on why white people stick together all the time, and I think we need to talk about that, because I would argue that we need to be asking white people to stop segregating themselves and to be more integrated with people who are not white.
Exactly. Get to know them.
Yeah, get to know them. Because when that happens, I think the Asian kids are going to be more likely to not be moved to be together as much, because there's a protection thing there. And so if white people are making it's uncomfortable for Asian people to integrate within them, they're not going to want to do that. So I feel like the burden is on white people to be more inclusive. So I don't know. That's what.
No, I would totally agree. And I the other piece is, I would imagine because of the power of privilege in the United States, and when we're looking at it from the lens of race, the power of white privilege, you could ask. I'm gonna guess that you could ask a random white person pretty easily about, like, when's the last time that you had that you intentionally chose to engage with someone who is different from yourself, and they would either have to think about it for a while, like, oh, I've never even thought about it, right?
Right.
Not because they're waking up in the morning and being like intentional about, I'm gonna avoid everybody who's different than me, but because they've never had to think about it. It's just not even in their wheelhouse of tools to think about. And it's because they live in bubbles, and all the things they need access to are also in their bubble, right? And that's power and privilege. That is substantial in a lot of ways. So very much they didn't even fathom the conversation before. I'm going to argue that some folks try to be intentional and try to unlearn stuff, but we're not at a critical mass at this point, I'm going to argue.
Thank you. Next question is, are there certain races that are discriminated against more than others, and why do you think so?
Oh my goodness. These questions are so hard.
You can make it easy.
So I don't know. That question is hard because I don't know that it's. I guess I would say that what is there a reason for that question? Because I think that part of asking the question is who's discriminated against most is a question that further segregates us, particularly marginalized groups. So if somebody comes to me and says, you need to pay attention to the Latinx community, specifically like Mexican and immigrants from Latin America, because these issues are really important and they're being discriminated against and being killed, and their families are being separated and all these kinds of things. And as a black person, I say, I'm not paying attention to that because black people have been discriminated against since the beginning of since 1500 in this country, blah blah blah. Because I feel like, our issues are not being paid attention to, so I'm not going to pay attention to their issues. We're all losing. We're all losing. Because, again, white supremacy still gets to reign supreme. And so I feel like, you know, we need to pay attention to all injustices,
Right.
because my humanity is dependent upon whether or not these other issues in other groups are also solved. Like, you know, and not to be cliche or whatever, but, you know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's true. That's true. We can't pick and choose. We all have to be fighting for each other. So, yeah.
I think
You can hold it. Yeah,
Sorry
my
about
hand
that.
is tired.
Maybe my turn now. I think you can see that that ideology, especially when you think about the progression of discrimination in race throughout the evolution of what is now the United States, because very early, when indentured servitude was very much a thing for people who were poor and white, but also wanted to go over to what we now know as the United States. It wasn't then at that time. You know, they were very often much more connected with the African American, at that time, slaves in the area, because they were so very integrated in their lives and the work that they were doing from time to time. And so you would see a lot of things like interracial marriage, and we see the policies shift over time, specifically to keep them divided. So things like we actually start legally naming what it means to be black. We don't even have a name for what whiteness is yet. We name black first, and then we name what it is to be white, because then we can make it illegal for you to get married, for example. And we also think about it from the lens of, as they were doing Western expansion from the colonies, they gave rights to people who were poor and white to get land, but they wouldn't give it to people of color, right? And so folks who were rich and lords and came over and were granted land like immediately, right? I'm gonna, for sake of ease, I'm gonna call those folks the rich white folks.
Right.
They didn't say, yeah, we'll move and we'll help move this boundary to the west, right? They didn't say that. They said, no, you white folks that are poor, you can have this land and you can move to the west. And so you will get something, right, for complying with this system that we're making. We're not going to give that to people of color, but we are going to use you as a physical buffer between us and our comfort and all the people who actually already live in that area that we're taking that land from, where there will inevitably be conflict. And those, of course, were a lot of our Native American, Indigenous, First Nation communities that were already there that we were taking land from. Right? We were
Right.
using poor white folks as a buffer and putting them in direct conflict with people of color all the way across, right? And giving them privileges so they were divided against people who were people of color as slaves in that inner nation. And so that divide and conquer piece is wildly detrimental and shows up in all kinds of ways. You can also see it in the women's movement, for example. White women were given the right to vote in 1924, but only after they started separating themselves intentionally from people of color so that they could get the right to vote.
Wow.
And that's sickening, because people of color didn't get the right to vote until 1965. And
Wow.
that shouldn't have been that way. We should have never been that way. But to get a little something, to get a crumb, we were willing to separate. And so it's, sorry, I'm really passionate about that.
Yeah.
But it's just another example of why when we divide against each other, we're easily conquered, and we stay in a system that hurts people. If we would have all been much more intentional about that from the very beginning, we wouldn't be in a kind of position like this, right?
Right.
So, okay. You good?
Yeah.
All right.
Wow, thank you. The next question here is, do you think that white flight still exists? And if so, what parts of the metropolitan area?
What part of what now?
Can't say that.
yeah,
in the
yeah,
metro
yeah.
area.
Oh, gosh.
It's a long word.
Yeah, that still exists. As
But
long as the city is segregated, that's existing. Yeah.
Can you please explain what is white flight?
White flight is when people of color. So there's a critical mass, and I don't know. Forgive me for not knowing the numbers, but when people of color, specifically Black people, especially in Kansas City, move into certain neighborhoods, white people who live in those neighborhoods will leave. So this started in the early part of the last century. And so when you hear things like redlining and housing segregation, that's all a product of that. And there were and the government was heavily involved historically in segregating communities. With things like the GI Bill. The GI Bill only applied to white people, so it gave home loans to white people of lower income so that they could buy homes in certain areas, and usually in suburban areas. And these types of loans were denied to black people and Latino people and people of color. So that was one thing that happened, and then also just in terms of private funding. Of course, Black people and people of color were denied loans and other opportunities to own homes. And homes are one of the most significant way that the wealth disparity happened. So when you own a home, you automatically or over time develop a lot of equity and a lot of wealth in that home. But if you're denied the opportunity to own a home, you're not going to be able to build up that wealth. So a lot of the wealth disparities that you see today are a product of the government systematically denying Black people opportunities to own homes. So anyway, white flight is a much broader term for that because that type of segregation happened that way, but also just generally, again, when people of color move into neighborhoods, white people tend to leave because they see it as a sign that the property values are going down in those neighborhoods. So in Kansas City, the suburban communities, now like the outer suburban communities, because it used to be when I was young, it was like Grandview and Raytown were white communities. Now those are like kind of first tier suburbs, and those are largely or more significantly minority communities. So white people went farther out. Once Black people started moving into those first tier suburbs, white people moved farther out, and so now they're way out in Lee Summit and Blue Valley, and way out in Johnson County, and that's a product of it's so complicated because the other thing I'm not saying is that the thing that communities of color do is that when they start to make money. Now this wasn't a possibility in the early part of the last century because they just simply weren't allowed to live in white neighborhoods. But now, when you start to have a certain income and you make a certain amount of money, in order to make a better life for your family, conceivably, because it's not exactly true, families typically will try to move into white neighborhoods, white spaces, and so that's what they were doing when they were moving into initially Grandview and Raytown. Because they were trying to, put their kids in better schools and present their families with opportunities that they wouldn't have had if they stayed in the city. Of course, when they did that, white people saw it as property values and the value of the education and everything going down, and then would move further out to the suburbs. So actually what you're seeing now is sort of a reversal of that. I guess not exactly a reversal. Something else is happening now where, so while that was happening, the city was being neglected. So businesses were leaving. There was lots of neglect in the city. There was not a lot of development happening. Downtown area was only, office spaces. There was no like entertainment or anything. And this was evident when I was growing up. Downtown was like dead. There was nothing downtown. It's just like where people went to work and then they left and went out to the suburbs to live. Now there's all this redevelopment that's happening because white people are now, not all, because there's still obviously large white communities in these outer tier suburbs. But now, especially with younger white folks, they're coming back into the city. And now, following that, there's lots of redevelopment that's happening. So you get things like Power and Light, and they're doing all this development around outside the plaza and Westport and all these communities in the city. And so all the folks of color who, for whatever reason, were not able to leave the city are no longer able to afford those places, and then they have to find other places to live. So then they go out to Grandview and Raytown and places like that. So that is a very brief synopsis of what is happening, but yeah.
Very factual. Okay, next question is, this is a very long one.
Okay.
How does the Division of Diversity and Inclusion focus to combat segregation? That's the first part.
Okay.
Do you want to answer that first?
How does our office work to combat segregation?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think that our office. Oh, thanks. I think that our office primarily works on so as far as policies and things like that, we only work with you at UMKC. So we don't really do anything in terms of that I know of in terms of implementing policies and things out in the city. But I think that our job, what we do that might hopefully affect what happens in the community, is developing an awareness around these issues, and then helping people to understand that it's okay to talk about these things. In fact, it's required of us to talk about these things, because if we don't talk about it, nothing's going to change. A lot of times people feel like, if I talk about racism, if I talk about classism, if I talk about sexism, it must make me a racist, classist, sexist. No, that's not true. We have to talk about these things. We have to name it. We have to face it. And so a lot of what we do is help people get comfortable with talking about them. If you acknowledge that Kansas City is really segregated, and that J.C. Nichols was really racist, or if you acknowledge those things, it helps us to come up with solutions on how to, because I can't solve it if I don't name the problem, right? So we have to be able to do it. So anyway, I'm saying all that to say that we're doing that on a smaller scale. Well, some in the community, but mostly at UMKC. And then hopefully, and not just students, but primarily students will be able to take that information and go out into the world and think about problems and solutions in a different way, incorporating their awareness of how racism affects every single part of their lives, how sexism affects every single part of their lives in their decision making when they go out into whatever they end up doing in engineering, in medicine, in whatever, So I think that's how we might impact segregation in the city.
Okay, the second part is to combat segregation and increase diversity here in Kansas City area. And what can we do at our school and in Johnson County to do the same?
You want to take that one?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you say that one more time?
Yeah.
Please?
And increase diversity here in Kansas City area. And what can we do at our school and in Johnson County to do the same?
Right. Okay. So much about what Dr. King was just saying was about we're in the business of consciousness raising, right? We want our students to be conscious because we know that our students are going to be significant decision makers, both here in our community, but also off in the giant world when they're making decisions in their jobs, when they become really big deals and CEOs and rock stars and all of that, right? And so we want to know that we gave them the best, most thorough kind of education that helps them and challenges them to think about systemic outcomes rather than what can I do to make the largest dollar sign today, kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
And so when we think about that from the consciousness raising standpoint, anyone can do that, right? And further, we could do more of it. We can do it everywhere, right? And so when we, and at a critical mass, when we create a space where folks are able to, where that is a norm rather than that thing that that group of people over there are talking about, we shift the culture, we shift the climate, and a place that feels like people care and that people are genuinely seeing and engaging and caring for each other is a place where people want to be. And so that, just in its nature, would attract more people and a more diverse group of people. And of course, that's like a snowball, right? Because the more diversity there is, the more we understand, the better off we are, the more people want to actually be there because it's a good place where people understand and engage and want to do better, right?
True.
So it's this beautiful thing. But you have to get the snowball started. And so that would increase diversity in the city. It would also increase, like what you could do in a school is simply have those conversations, right? And maybe that means, like, I don't know, an after-school group decides that they're going to have a dialogue circle where they talk about diversity and they all go out and they read or watch one documentary and then they come back and they talk about it and then, you know, do some of that, like, wondering and reflecting about, like, how is that impacting us? What does that look like? Because there is infinite number of, like, things that you could see and watch that are available both for very cheap and free, and I'm a big fan of libraries, so I'd say you can even start there pretty easily.
Yeah.
And get some of that information, start doing some of that consciousness raising and wondering in community together, right? Because the other thing is that to really do meaningful work around diversity and inclusion and making community stronger, you have to do it in community, right? Because me, myself, as one person, have one set of life experiences, and I can do a lot of book reading and documentary watching and wondering, but if I only do it by myself, my learning ability is significantly limited based on my human capital resources, right? But if I'm learning in community, then not only are other folks going to help me learn by being like, actually, Lana, did you think about it this way? And then I'd be like, aha, lesson learned, thank you. But also, other folks get to learn when I make a mistake and learn from it, or when I'm learning something new that I'm excited about and sharing, then suddenly they all get to learn it too, and they didn't have to put in all that extra time, right? And so that's a much more efficient way of learning. And so creating those places where people are engaging in having that conversation makes a really big difference in terms of if we're going to talk about it from an efficiency standpoint.
Right.
Right. And I think you could apply that both to schools as well as Johnson County or a city overall. You want to add?
Yeah. So can I? How diverse? What are the demographics of Blue Valley West?
There's like, I think, if I can remember right, because I'm part of the Diversity Leadership Council at our school, we've done the statistics before, and I think like 85% is white population, and then the next highest is either Asian or Black.
Okay.
So it's a very high white population, and given that we are in Johnson County, that can be expected.
Right. So unfortunately, and this is another burden of being part of, minority groups, usually minorities are burdened with being the people who bring these issues up, right? I don't know what to do about that, but it's the way it is. When people are part of the dominant group, so if the school's 85% white, there's nothing really, unless you have some like really impressive white people, there's nothing really gonna motivate white people to do any work around, making sure that that the space is inclusive for everybody. And usually it takes like a critical incident for that to happen. Critical incidents or the minority groups to be saying, hey, this is what's going on, let's do something, let's do some education or training or awareness or whatever, cultural awareness or whatever for the entire school. So I don't know, that's the way it is. And it still has to be done. I think the other thing that is effective is when you find people in the dominant group, and so I'm sticking with race just because that's an easier thing to talk about, and obviously very obvious for Blue Valley West, if it's 85% white. If there are people or white people in that school who are very passionate about these issues, and are willing to like put themselves on the line and go out and talk about these, be willing and able to talk about ways to make Blue Valley West more inclusive and more diverse. That's a plus. Use that, because the impact will be different for white, and that's the term we say, allies or accomplices. For white allies and accomplices to be on the front lines also. I would say in order to, in answer to your question, it's that awareness piece, it's that getting used to being able to talk about these issues and be comfortable with who you are so that other people are comfortable also with who you are.
Oh, from the thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate talking about the fact that so much of the burden very often sits on the groups that are being oppressed. That's really essential. As someone who holds a dominant group identity, regardless of the lens that you're thinking about, if one wants to be involved or be engaged in change work to make things better for a group that they don't necessarily identify with in their own personal lived experience, the only other thing I would add is that it is essential to work in relationship with the group that is being impacted as well, right? So for example, I identify as white. It would be pretty inappropriate for me to be charging in to quote unquote singularly lead the work on racism, partially because I cannot even pretend to think that I know everything there is to know about the impact of racism and how it manifests in every single way. And in fact, because I grew up in an environment where racism was prevalent, whether or not I understood that it was what was happening or not, and I'm going to argue that's everywhere, right? We all grew up in that. There are still things that I'm going to bump into as I'm learning and growing that very much are still racist, right? And so if I don't know and I'm not working in community, right, and I'm not working deeply with people of color in the work that is being done, then I'm going to re-perpetuate that, even with the intent of quote unquote doing good things or being a good person. And so, regardless of the lens with which you would like to do work, always be mindful about that and about who is the leader. Is there one leader? And if you are a dominant identity person, you probably should not be the leader, or at least not be the singular leader by any means. It's important to be there. It's important to participate, and you can't be working in isolation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. The next question here is, do you think that there's a difference between the way that KCPD treats minorities versus Caucasians?
I'm
just bombarding you with questions.
I know, and I don't. Again, I can't speak for what is going on in we can't speak for what's in the minds of Kansas City police. I will say that we should steer away from saying the term Caucasian, just because it's historically an oppressive term. It was, I mean, if you want the history, I can give it to you, but we should say white or European American or something like that.
Okay.
But aside from that, do we feel like KCPD mistreats people of color? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I'm going to speak more broadly about police because I don't know specifically about KCPD.
Well, and if any of the questions do make you, any of you uncomfortable, you do not have to answer
I don't know what, I mean, we're all, I'm going to say this, we are all humans, including police. And because we are all human, we are all susceptible to very human things like bias and stereotypes. So the fact that, we receive messages about who a person is because of the way they look, again, like when we talked about earlier about what stereotyping is, it's like if you don't know people, if you're not really, if you're making determinations about who people are based upon the messaging that you receive, so all black people are criminals, if you look brown, you're either undocumented or you're Muslim terrorist or something, so these are the messages that we're receiving. As humans, police are not absolved of that. They're not immune to that, so they're susceptible to acting on those stereotypes just like we all are. On top of that, they have guns and ways to harm people, and not just like killing somebody, but also who they choose to arrest and who they choose not to arrest, and how they treat people when they interact with them. So they're given authority, and I'm not saying, I'm not, anti-police, we should get rid of all of them or anything like that. I'm just saying these things are things that we should be thinking about, because people's lives are at stake. We all know about all the police shootings. They're recorded and all these kinds of things now. But also, if and this is, so I'm going to speak about Missouri because I'm more familiar with Missouri, but I doubt that it's different in Kansas. Black people are stopped by police more often than they are by white people, and they're arrested at a higher rate, and they're obviously incarcerated at a much higher rate. So these are things that we need to be thinking about. And I know for a fact that black people are not more prone to crime than anybody else. So why do these patterns exist?
I would also suggest that you, I don't know about if there are even statistics available for KCPD. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't either.
But they are available for the police for the state of Missouri.
Okay.
And it's very much worth looking into that because, we can't necessarily talk about that from a concrete aspect from Kansas City lens, we know that people are being arrested and incarcerated at much higher rates based on their race in the state of Missouri, and the Attorney General did the work for us in terms of releasing that data, and that just came out in the last year, less than a year, so that's really important to kind of keep in mind. It is one of the motivating factors, but not the only motivating factor for why the NAACP, yes.
Oh, the travel advisory.
Yeah, the travel advisory. Made their travel advisory for the state of Missouri, right? There was a lot of reasons to inform that decision that were very founded and fair. And so from that lens, we know that that's a thing. And it's important to acknowledge that. Now, how does that pan out with Kansas City specifically? I don't have that answer. But, maybe, I don't think they get down to cities. But Wesley Lowry works for the Washington Post, and his team won a Pulitzer for their work in terms of police shootings and things to that effect. And so that's specifically about shootings, murders, but they can tell you information in regards to police and actual shootings. So that's something to maybe consider as well. They break that stuff down by state as well, and race. And it's all available online for free. You don't have to talk to anyone to actually look at the data if you don't want to. So that's something worth considering.
Yeah, and I think just want to add that there is. I feel like I need to say that we need some person, some entity to call when we need help. Police are that thing that we have, and so there is a clear use for them. I think that that unfortunately they're who we call for things that I don't know that we should be calling the police for. You know, when someone's having some mental health or something that will require some mental health response or some non-emergent response, I think there should be other people we call. So that's like a huge thing that I don't know who's gonna be the first city to kind of implement something like that. And I know that KCPD has like a CIT folks who are trained on for these mental health calls or incidents that happen. So they're police that are trained in trauma and how to respond to folks who are having mental health issues. There are not a lot of them though, So so I think police are trained for a specific purpose, and I don't know. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done within the police and within the relationship between police and the communities that have largely been historically harassed by the police. And that sounds like a harsh term, but what I mean is communities that have larger police presence and not necessarily a good history of relationships with a police presence. So when you have a community where there's just a rampant sentiment of these people are not here to help us or protect us, that gets in the way of the benefits that the police can offer. So something needs to be done in order to remedy that, in order to fix that, so that people are being protected and not feeling like, not weighing the pros and cons of whether or not you're going to involve the police because you don't know what the outcome's going to be. So that it's a very real thing that's happening. The solution is very complex, just like the problem is complex. I can't say what KCPD specifically, whether it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just this is the experience that is happening all across the country.
Right.
And we need to be talking about it and figuring out ways to make it better, ways to prevent people from being hurt, ways to prevent community members from being hurt, ways to prevent police officers from being hurt, and so that everyone's needs get met. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question here is, what does the future look like for segregation and discrimination in the Kansas City Metro?
Okay.
Is it improving or is it bad? Or is it decreasing?
I don't know that it's... I don't know that it's improving. I would say probably staying the same. Since integration, it's improved in the sense that now people can legally live wherever they want to, but we're just as segregated now as we were 60 years ago. 60 years ago. So I don't know about improving. I mean, that's the short answer to that.
That's okay.
There was a fellow that came to our campus 2 weeks ago now. His name's D. Ray McKesson. And he said something that I don't think I'll ever forget. There's this saying that was, oh gosh, I can't remember the original person who said it, but Martin Luther King Jr. Said it in one of his very famous speeches that says that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Right? It's this idea of like inevitably it will happen, but it might take some time, and that's this like sense of like faith, right? Like certainty, it's happening. D. Ray McKesson said the difference between that and what I would argue hope is that there is a moral arc of the universe, and it will bend towards justice, but we have to intentionally bend it.
Wow.
And so it's this difference between I'm gonna hope and I'm gonna think good thoughts, and I would really like it to happen, but I'm going to sit here, right? Or I'm going to be involved, and I'm gonna take action, and I'm going to engage with my community and my neighbors, and have these conversations and be active and participate in what is really arguably maybe our civic duty, right? And so it's all about actively being involved. So if we want it to improve, which I think many people want it to be improved, we have to be engaged.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for those powerful words. And the last question here is, how is your experience with discrimination in your life? If you want to answer this question, it's okay.
I don't know. So you're asking for personal?
Yeah, personal experience.
Oh, okay. I mean, I guess I can just say that I've experienced a lot of privilege in my life, and those privileges have not protected me from all forms of discrimination. That's what I'll say about that.
Okay.
Yeah, and ditto, right? Let's hear. Would it be helpful to have an actual example? Because I can give you some examples.
If you would like.
Yeah, because I think that was my question, was it?
Last one was mine.
Oh, it was? Okay,
Yeah.
I felt like I asked a similar question.
Okay. And
If you're comfortable with sharing it.
Yeah, sure. Say it one more time to make sure I really capture it.
How is your experience with discrimination in your life?
Oh, okay.
Of any kind.
Sure. So I'm going to say present, accounted for, and pervasive, right? And so, and then sometimes maybe not accounted for the points where I was probably an aggressor in regards to discrimination and my level of awareness around that, you know. So, for example, I identify as a white cisgender female from a very poor background, low socioeconomic status. I am no longer in that same class, so I moved, right, in regards to my background and my family. And I am I'm invisibly disabled until I'm not. I've had arthritis since I was 10 years old, and at times it kept me from being able to walk and things like that.
Sorry about that.
Well, you know, it was a life experience, and it also made me who I am today, so I'll take it. So, like, there's a lot there, right? Like, I can tell you lots of stories about times where there was a lot of, like, crummy things said to me or done to me because of who I am. Infinite number of stories of being a female and being ignored, or microaggressive statements like, oh, she's pretty gutsy for a girl, or, oh, she's pretty smart for a girl, or, well, you shouldn't be out so late. Well, you didn't tell that to the other guys. What was the problem? Is it just me? Is the reason that I'm out as a female alone at night something that is my fault if something happens to me, or is it, you know, a perpetrator's fault, right?
Right.
That's just from the lens of being female. Now, on the other hand, I have easily been a perpetrator of discrimination in a lot of different ways. I grew up in a town that has been suspected of being, it was never codified into law, and James Lowen, who does work on sundown towns, never specifically identified the town concretely just yet in terms of being a sundown town, but it is a suspected sundown town. And what that means is that it's a town where if you were a person of color, by the time the sun was down, you better be out of the town. Otherwise, lots of awful things could happen to you. And in some cities, that was actually codified into law.
Wow.
In others, it was never written into law, but it was very much pervasive in how the climate and the culture was. So it didn't really, it operated the same regardless of it actually being written down, right? And a lot of the census numbers very much support that about the town that I'm from. So I grew up in a very white town, very rural town, with family members who never left that area and didn't have any relationship with folks who were different than themselves for the most part. And so I received any number of messages growing up about racism and race, and I learned history that was very whitewashed around the civil rights movement. And it's not that I didn't care about it, because whenever I had a chance to say a story or to do a project in history class that I could determine the topic, it was always about the civil rights movement, every single time. And I perpetuated whitewashed history around the civil rights movement every single time. And not one teacher ever challenged me on that. But is it because they didn't know, or because the climate was such a way that they couldn't say anything? I don't have that answer, even to this day. But it does mean that I was navigating my day not having any idea that the things that I thought I knew were problematic, right? And so it wasn't until even really college where my whole community changed, and I started having relationships with folks that were racially different than myself, where I started realizing, oh, I have a problem. Okay. And so those initial changes, unfortunately, I'm a perfect example of times where the burden of education landed squarely on people of color to educate me, right? Because I'm just wrecking balling my way through the day and not understanding that what I did was not okay. And so that is one example of how that can manifest, even when you're quote unquote a good white person and trying to be, do your best thing and thought that you were socially progressive and that you understood history and did your research, blah, 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 and you still didn't know, right?
Yeah.
And there's plenty there to work around and to continue to unpack. So yes, I'll leave it there. But that is an example of that can definitely manifest and continue if you're not being mindful about it.
Okay. Thank you very much for answering these 10 interview questions. Is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap it up?
Yes, hard questions. Hard questions.
And important questions, right?
Yes.
The work that you're doing is essential because, going back to what D. Ray McKesson would tell us, if we're not engaging, nothing will change. So keep going.
All right, thank you. If we need to contact you, is the email that we text you is the right one?
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.